So I watched The Breadwinner, very interesting movie. Now it's set in Afghanistan. Quick summary of the recent history. There was a ruler in Afghanistan who the Soviets liked. He was toppled. Soviets didn't like that, so they invaded during the Cold War. This is during the Cold War. Soviets invade. There's a long, brutal war that really ravages the country and lasts for a really, really long time. And eventually, the Soviets finally leave, partly due to the United States. There's a great movie, Charlie Wilson's War, very good movie about this. The United States funds a lot of these resistance elements, trying to get the Soviets to leave. Eventually, the Soviets leave the country. The people of Afghanistan so exhausted from war, their country just falling apart. They really are craving unity, strength, someone who's gonna unite the country because they want anything but more war. So the Taliban, which is a very radical group, that was part of the ones who repelled the Soviets. The Taliban take power, and they are honestly so brutal and so strict and so puritanical in their beliefs. People are surprised. Honestly, the majority of Afghanistan is surprised by just how brutal and awful and oppressive the regime really is. And honestly, the Taliban was very, very hated by the majority of the people, and it was a situation where it felt like the country was really held hostage by the Taliban to some extent. Al Qaeda has a base of operations within Afghanistan. They launched an attack on the U.S. 9/11, and the U.S. invades, drives the Taliban out. The Taliban still exists, but they're not in power, and this is still ongoing. So basically, the war, it's the U.S.'s longest war. Their involvement in Afghanistan, and there's no end in sight. So this is set during the Taliban rule. So after the Soviets have pulled out, before the American invasion, there's a young girl. And during this time, women have to be covered. There's curfews, a lot of restrictions. One of these restrictions is women need a male guardian to escort them around. So this family, after the father of the family, he's arrested and is in jail, they can't do the simplest things. They can't even use their own money to go and buy food at the market because there's no male that can escort them around. So she starts to cross-dress and actually tries to pass as a male, and she does this to try to support her family. So very simple premise, but very interesting premise. It's very interesting to think how widespread was this phenomenon during this time. Now it is animated, and it's an interesting choice to pair animation with this very dark subject matter, but I think it was really used effectively. Now some of the characters, the people, in particular the baby, they're animated to look very silly and cartoonish and kind of add an element of warmth. But a lot of the backdrops, if you look at the city, if you look at the mountains, looks almost real. So I thought it was kind of an interesting mix of highly stylized animation for some of the characters and more realistic, almost looked like live action. Now, some things I really liked. I loved how it explored the role of storytelling, that human universal, and how storytelling can be used in different ways. It's how you use stories. So stories can be used as a kind of escapism and a kind of distraction and something that actually prevents social change and can be kind of an opium of the masses and something that people use to avoid dealing with reality, avoid dealing with their problems. Or stories can be used to unite people and mobilize people, and you can gather people around a story and they can be an agent of social change. So it's all in how you use something. And then you look at the Taliban, a couple of things jump out at you. One is just how some people, when you're following the rule of the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law, just how horrible some of the consequences of that can be. So they would say, look, we have this rule, no females allowed outside without a male guardian. You could say, well, look, this family, they're all going to starve. They have no male who can escort them. So surely there must be some exception, some kind of look at the context and some kind of exception to be made, some kind of human compassion. And no, there's no compassion. It's the law, it's the rule. And if they have to starve, then so be it. Adherence to the rule and the law above all else. And very interesting when you look at the Taliban, as they were the most puritanical, and they were the most in their sense more in their mind moral, and they were the strictest of the whole country, and they had all the power as a very strict minority. And you compare it to, let's say, America. In America, the police, you could argue maybe they're a bit more authoritarian, maybe a bit more aggressive than the general population, but most would say morally they're about the same as the average person. They drink, they smoke, they have premarital sex, they probably watch porn. If you look at the morality of the police versus the morality of the people they're policing, it's probably roughly the same. Not so in Afghanistan during this time. You looked at the people who had all the power, they had the guns, they were the enforcers. They weren't people who just wanted power and were just using this. No, they were the most strict and the most puritanical, and you see a minority foisting their very strict views on the majority. And somewhat unique, you see often a majority inflicting their views on the minority. That's a common phenomenon. You sometimes see a plurality inflicting their views on another plurality, but for a minority of people to truly inflict their beliefs that aren't widely held throughout the rest of the population, for a minority to inflict their views on a majority, it's somewhat rare, and that's what made the Taliban rule so horrible. It really was a people somewhat kept captive. And you get this tragic scene where a teacher, he sees a former pupil of his, and the pupil, this member of the Taliban, is so enraged at his teacher, and he says, "You filled my head with all this useless knowledge." And it's interesting to think that for some people, and for this person in this movie, he's associated religion and knowledge and science as fundamentally opposed to each other. And it just drives home this point that this isn't inherently so. It's not true across time. It's true in particular situations. And one of the tragedies of modern times is we've seen the West as associated very much with secularism and very much with science. And for a lot of these people who believe in radical Islam, they see the West and science as one and the same. So they think Islam's at war with the West, so they think that science is inherently wicked and inherently bad. And you see Boko Haram, Western education is forbidden. And this isn't true. If you look across all religions, there are certainly religions, you think Buddhism, but even Hinduism or Judaism, there isn't this opposition between religion and knowledge and learning. So it's not an inherent thing to religion. It's also not an inherent thing to any particular religion. If you look at Christianity, it varies by region. In the United States, there's this large strain of Christianity that seems to think that science and religion are very opposed and inherently opposed. But this isn't true in other parts of the world, and it's not true throughout history. So in the Middle Ages, it's a relatively recent phenomenon, this idea of science and religion being not opposed to each other. There was a time where the smartest people, the people who are most devoted to learning and bookkeeping and the rise of that, they were one and the same with the church. So it is just interesting how things change and ebb and flow, and particularly now we see a particularly pernicious coincidence where we see the West being associated with science. We also see this rise of radical Islam and seeing the West as a threat, and then this leads to really horrible anti-intellectualism. And then last thing that really jumps out at you is this idea of female dependence on males. And you could say, well, why did the Taliban come up with this rule? Why do any of these societies come up with this rule that females can't leave the house without a male guardian? And you can debate, but one reason is it's the extreme of just keeping females dependent on males. So you look at the maternity leave debate, and you look at the debate in, let's say, North America about maternity leave. And you could say in a very roundabout way, if women don't have access to maternity leave, if they want to have a baby, there's going to be a time where they're not going to be receiving any income. So in a way, if they want to have a baby, which a lot of people want, then they to some extent have to be in a relationship with a male. So it's a very roundabout way of keeping women, I guess, dependent on men in some sense if you don't have maternity leave as a policy. Here we see the extreme example of that, where women can't even leave the house to buy bread with their own money. And you have a situation where women either have to be dependent on a man bringing them food, or they have to be dependent on the man bringing them to go get food out in the market. So it's just sometimes you see just the most extreme literal examples of something, and it's very shocking. And I love how in this movie you get a sense of the setting and Afghanistan, and you get a sense of the good and some of the different elements. You get the market and the haggling, something we don't really have here in North America, but very much a part of different parts of the world. We see the bad, we see the abandoned tanks, which kind of fun in the movie. They play on it, but an after effect of a very tragic war, and then also a more serious after effect are landmines, and huge after effect of the long war with the Soviets is these landmines that are still around today, still very deadly. And I'll leave with a book recommendation. One of my favorite authors, the guy who wrote The Kite Runner, very famous book. Now, I read Kite Runner, pretty good. I read his second one, A Thousand Splendid Suns, didn't like that one as much, but one of my favorite books of all time, and one of the best experiences I've had reading a book, it's called And the Mountains Echoed. And it's the same setting, has a lot of the same themes, talks about storytelling a lot, and there's different characters, and one of them's a storyteller in the book. So very similar setting and themes, but it's one of my favorite books of all time. I had such an amazing experience reading it. One of those books that makes me feel, a lot of movies and TV shows, they make me feel emotions a lot. sometimes books, it's harder. I don't find I have as much of an emotional reaction to it, but this book hits you hard. So great book recommendation I would have.